The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, bailing out America's big banks. The man who policed the last bailout says, watch out. There will be a next time, and it will be much worse.
S&P put out an estimate saying that the next crisis may cost $5 trillion in upfront cost just to deal with the large institutions and their assets. Where are we going to find $5 trillion?
Also, many meds, private health insurance on the cheap. But what happens when you really need hospital coverage?
A Cedars-Sinai admissions agent stated quite clearly, this policy is useless. This doesn't even cover one day in a room at Cedars-Sinai. And how are we going to pay for the bill?
And opening day, an exhibit unveiled in New York, but the artist is behind bars in China.
It is a bittersweet honor to welcome all of you here today to celebrate a remarkable piece of public art by one of the world's most creative and courageous public citizens, Ai Weiwei.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports. Good evening. This past week brought news that our already fragile economic recovery may be stalling. Unemployment is still hovering around 9%. Foreclosure rates remain incredibly high, and Americans continue to be on edge. Wall Street, however, is doing quite well, and the banking part of this crisis at least seems to be behind us. But tonight you're going to hear from a former watchdog with a warning that the measures put in place to avoid another financial meltdown are woefully insufficient. He says another crisis is lurking on the horizon. It's a scary vision of the future, but before you can appreciate what it means, you have to remember where we've been. It was mid-September 2008, and economic Armageddon loomed on the horizon.
This has truly been a manic Monday on Wall Street.
At one point, the market fell as if down a well.
Free fall in Asian stock markets.
Stocks all around the world are tanking.
Housing prices were falling. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. Banks had stopped lending. Panic ensued. Struggling to stave off catastrophe, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, devised an emergency plan with a staggering price tag and went to Capitol Hill to sell it.
We look forward to working closely with Congress to resolve this financial crisis and get our economy moving again.
A $700 billion taxpayer-funded bailout. The original idea was for Treasury to buy the bank's toxic assets so the banks could begin lending again. On October 3, 2008, after much arm-twisting, President Bush signed the bill that created TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program.
Success or failure will depend on whether Treasury...
2 months later, Neil Barofsky entered the scene. Barofsky was an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York when he was appointed as the Special Inspector General for TARP. His job? To oversee the money. He served in Washington for nearly 2.5 years and stepped down in March. Tonight, he says that the government broke its promise to use that money to help Main Street, not just Wall Street, and that the controversial bailout has left a dangerous legacy. If I'm a welder in Wichita or a carpenter in Casper, tell me why, if there's a reason why, I shouldn't be outraged that the bankers and Wall Street, bearing a lot of responsibility for getting us into the near meltdown stage, have profited greatly from this, but the country as a whole has suffered greatly.
You should be outraged. You should be outraged if you're in that situation. because that wasn't the deal. You shouldn't be angry necessarily that Wall Street is doing well. It's good for the country if Wall Street does well. Again, we wouldn't want to be back where we were in 2008 with the banks going under but the other part of that equation, the Main Street part of the equation, you should be angry. And perhaps you should be a little bit mad at Wall Street, but you really should be mad at your government for not fulfilling the promise that they made to you.
The HBO movie Too Big to Fail ends with Secretary Paulson, played by William Hurt, trying to convince his staff that the banks will actually take the money and lend it out. I want to review the end of the movie, so let's take a look.
I hope they use the money the way we're asking them to. They will lend it out, won't they?
Of course they will. Of course they will.
Of course they will, he says. That is, the banks will take the money and lend it out. Have the banks lent the money out?
Absolutely not. Lending continued to contract throughout the crisis and through what is now a sort of recovery. And I think that lending is down 10 in the last quarters. The banks continue to have not been putting this money out on the street. And all this happened even after the largest banks were permitted to pay back TARP funds, and lending continued to contract more and more.
Why is that?
Well, I think in part you sort of see it in the movie, and I don't know if that scene is exactly what happened, but it does represent what the government's policy. So when they gave the banks this money, when they announced that they were going to put $125 billion into just 9 of the largest institutions, and they justified it. They said, we're going to do this because our goal is to increase lending. That's why we're going to do this, and this was the policy goal. But there was no policy, there was nothing put in place to implement that goal. So it was just hope. There was no restrictions, there were no strings attached, there were no requirements that the bank use this money to increase lending. There weren't even incentives, carrots, things so that the bank could make it in the bank's own interest to lend out the money. So what happened was the banks got this money and they decided that it was in their best interest, in the best interest of their shareholders, not to lend it out, but to use it to accumulate capital, to make investments, to lend the money back to the United States by buying treasuries and sort of locking in secure profits, and not lend the money. And it's not terribly surprising if you have a big policy goal, but you don't do anything to make sure that that policy gets carried out, that policy is going to be a failure. And this was a failure.
Well, let's back up for a moment. The government had the negotiating edge in the beginning. We had the money. We're going to give you this money for bailout. Why weren't restrictions put in place?
I think it was two things that underlie this failure. One, I think it was a lack of appreciation of just how much leverage that they had. And I think there was a sense back then, there was actually some concerns that the banks wouldn't take the money. Now, I don't really see, looking back, how that could have been perceived. I mean, ultimately, these were the regulators of these banks. They could have forced them to take the money. And I think the second part was there was this inherent trust in the banks and large financial institutions. Notwithstanding everything that had happened leading up into the crisis, there was just this general belief that the banks would do the right thing on their own. Dan, I can't tell you how many times when making recommendations to Treasury, when I was Special Inspector General on this TARP program or that TARP program, and I would point out a vulnerability to fraud or a problem that may get away in the program, and a government official would say to me, "Oh, Neil, you don't understand. These are banks. They're not going to risk their reputation by doing the wrong thing." I was 8 days into the job, and I said, pretty common sense idea. Hey guys, let's make the banks tell us how they're using their funds. Because the goal of this is to get them to increase lending. Let's be able to track it in real time and tell the American taxpayers, who ultimately are the persons who provided all this money, let's tell them what they're doing with the money. And Dan, you would think that I declared a communist revolution from the reaction. I was told that this idea was terrible. I didn't know what I was talking about. I was going to destroy the banking system. I was going to destroy the economy. So much pushback.
Frankly, to the uninitiated, it seems elemental. You're going to give the banks the money, say, let's have some accountability of how you're using the money. But who didn't do that? Was it the president? Was it the Secretary of Treasury?
Ultimately, it's the Secretary of the Treasury. So today, that's Timothy Geithner, the current Secretary of the Treasury, absolutely.
Did you ever talk to the Secretary of the Treasury about this?
I had periodic meetings with him. In fact, the last time I met with him was in November 2009 on this topic of requiring the banks to finally report on how they're using TARP funds. And ultimately, after that meeting is when Treasury finally got around to doing it, at least requiring the reporting. But of course, by that time, the largest banks were well on their way to have paid back the funds, and the leverage was lost.
Well, now TARP's defenders say it was a resounding success. They say that not only was the country saved from financial ruin, a real meltdown, but that most of the money has been paid back with interest.
Well, I think if you look narrowly at those two goals, it's been successful. So the goals being preventing financial Armageddon and not having as catastrophic of losses on this program as we originally thought, sure, and that's good news, and I don't want to take away from that as being good news. But the program was supposed to do more than just prevent a collapse. It was supposed to restore home owning. It was supposed to keep up to 4 million people in their homes and not lose them to foreclosure. That was a very significant, broadly, boldly stated goal, and really part of the reason why the administration was able to convince Congress to authorize $700 billion to bail out the banks.
Your critics say, and I'm quoting here, that you're just Monday morning quarterbacking and that no deal could be perfect when it was that frenzied and hastily put together out of necessity. Fair criticism?
I embrace being called a Monday morning quarterback. That was my job. You know, Dan, every NFL coach, after a game, what is the first thing they do Monday morning?
Analyze the film.
Why? Because they want to be better the next week. Why as a country can't we look at the film and get better for the next week?
Well, why not?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think politics plays a large part in all of this. This is a very politically sensitive program, very, very deep feelings on both sides of the aisle about the program. And I think Washington is a place now where there is a political pain for admitting that you make a mistake and changing a policy, even if it means driving that policy into the ground.
I, and I know a lot of other people, have at least the vague sense, well, we've been through a bad period, mistakes were made, but we're coming out of it. What's wrong with that view of anything?
The danger to that thinking is forgetting that all of the structures, all of the things that led to the last financial crisis are still in place. You know, part of the reason why we had this last financial crisis was, you know, the name of the movie that we just watched, Too Big to Fail. And what has changed since 2008? The only thing that has changed is that now it's explicit. We're not going to let these banks fail.
But can we afford to bail them out a second time? It'd be much more expensive, wouldn't it?
It is a terrible place that we're going to find ourselves. Because, first of all, they're bigger now than they were before. You know, part of the reaction...
They're bigger now than they were before.
20% bigger. Because part of the reaction, part of what the government did was encourage them to get bigger. So when Bear Stearns got in trouble, when Wachovia got in trouble, when WAMU got in trouble, these huge institutions, they got swallowed up by even bigger banks. And as a result, we can't let them fail. But the cost will be extraordinary. S&P put out an estimate saying that the next crisis may cost $5 trillion in upfront cost just to deal with the large institutions and their assets. Where are we going to find $5 trillion?
Good question. Where are we going to find it?
I have no idea. And that's where the path that we're down on as a country.
Counselor, you're scaring me.
You should be scared. I'm scared. I mean, you can't not be scared. You can't look at what happened in the run-up to 2008 and see how it's not going to repeat itself given what we've done.
If I'm a banker talking about taking risk and ever-increasing risk, where's the incentive for me not to take irresponsible risk when I can say to myself, it's now guaranteed. If we get in trouble again, the people of the United States will bail us out again.
It's actually even worse than that, Dan, because there's pressure on you as that executive to actually take on more and more risk. You know, Chuck Prince, who was the CEO of Citi, famously told Hank Paulson when he was Secretary of Treasury in late 2007, he said to him, Hank, can't you order us not to take so much risk? He also famously said, as long as the music's playing, you got to get up and dance. So there are pressure on these institutions to take on more and more risk because with more risk becomes more profits. And that is exactly what's happening in the market right now. The largest banks have a bigger advantage than others. The rating agencies are giving them increased ratings specifically on the assumption that the government will bail them out. and that distorts the entire market in exactly the manner that you just said.
Dodd-Frank, named after Senator Dodd and Congressman Frank, it was a landmark financial reform bill. It created a new council that is supposed to identify threats to the system and, quote, wind down failing banks in an orderly manner. Now, the bill passed. Has that happened? Is it happening?
It's not. Now, it did give the power to regulators to do these types of things, to address the size of the institutions, how much money they're able to borrow, their leverage limits, how much money they keep on hand in capital, to save for a rainy day. It has all the abilities to do so.
So it gave them the power.
Enormous power.
How about the resources to implement that power?
They likely have the resources, but what it doesn't give them is the will. The political and regulatory will will be required to actually take on these problems. And we've seen very, very little progress on this front. And what you're really asking here is you're asking the financial regulators, the exact same regulators who were asleep at the switch leading up until 2008. Now you wave a wand through legislation and say that suddenly they're going to get it next time. They're going to know, they're going to see the next bubble, they're going to be able to identify, and they're going to be able to use these powers to rein in the banks, to have the appropriate mechanisms, to wind them down, to make sure they don't get too big. It's just not very likely. And there's one voice that you hear coming out of Washington, FDIC Chair Sheila Bair, who comes out and has been very forceful about this and has said, look, we're going to fail the mission that we were given by Congress to rein in these banks unless we use these powers to, where necessary, to simplify, shrink, do the right things to these banks. And you know what the response has been in Washington, Dan? Nothing. Silence. The Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, the other entities that are responsible for carrying this out have said nothing, and she, of course, is stepping down in a few weeks, and it looks like they're just waiting out the clock on her.
Well, now, many people, including President Obama and the Treasury Secretary, say that there won't be any more taxpayer-funded bailouts. They've made those statements. Do you believe them? Should I believe them?
You shouldn't believe them. Not right now. The market doesn't believe them, and ultimately it's the market that matters. And I don't know anyone outside of someone who's giving a politically motivated speech who believes that right now, today, that if one of our largest institutions were to fail, that the government would not bail them out.
Let's pretend I'm President Obama. Say to you, Counselor, I only have a short time here, but give me one thing that you think I, as President of the United States, could do that isn't being done that would help.
Tell those regulators that their #1 priority should be reining in the size and the significance of the largest financial institutions, to use all the powers that they fought so deeply for Dodd-Frank, and use them to make sure that when he came out and said that the era of bank bailouts are over, that promise is kept.
Counselor, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it very much.
It was truly my pleasure.
My pleasure. Neil Borofsky. We'll continue to follow the attempts of regulators to monitor the financial industry and await the results of ongoing investigations. Now, coming up next in our program, the high cost of so-called affordable health insurance. So stay here with us. Welcome back. And now an investigation of the private health insurance industry and a coverage plan commonly called a mini-med. There's a growing segment of American workers who depend on mini-meds. They're widely sold as an alternative to expensive comprehensive care. Mini-meds can offer more affordable premiums in exchange for limited benefits, and that's the key. Pay close attention to this story because a former sales agent has gone public, shedding light on the mini-med policies of one particular company that targeted the self-employed and which he says covered little in the very expensive world of modern health care. The deceptions were so egregious that late last year, the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office filed a suit on behalf of the people of California against the company and its Wall Street owners, saying the policies were, quote, junk. But for some policyholders, they don't need a lawsuit to tell them what can happen when a mini-med policy comes up short.
The policy that we had, really at the end of the day, just felt like it made everything worse at a time when it was hard to imagine how anything could be worse.
Howard Wolfenden and his wife Charlotte worked in Hollywood. She was an actress turned costume designer, and he had a small production company. But when Wolfenden's company folded and they lost their Blue Cross group plan, they needed to find new insurance for themselves and their young daughter Eleanor. After Wolfenden contacted various insurance companies in early 2004, an agent came to the Wolfenden house and pitched them a policy.
There was an understanding that this was not a policy that necessarily was carte blanche to access health care ad nauseum, but it was a very workable policy for a young family such as ours, in our circumstance, and in addition also covered, of course, you know, the thing that we all strive to cover against, which of course is catastrophic circumstance.
That policy was underwritten by a company now known as Health Markets, a billion-dollar Texas-based insurance company selling low-cost health plans across America. According to Wolfenden, their agent assured them that their new policy would offer similar coverage to their former Blue Cross plan. The only significant difference, he said, would be a higher deductible. But a year and a half later, when Charlotte became seriously ill, she needed an expensive test, which the hospital told them was not covered by their health insurance.
I needed to write them a check for $6,500, which of course at the time I had no choice but to write, so I wrote them the check. And then of course I was informed that the $5,000 deductible, which up till that point I had thought was an annual deductible, it turned out that that was not an annual deductible, but in fact it was a per occurrence deductible.
Charlotte's illness turned out to be cancer, and when she needed surgery and chemotherapy, the family was shocked to find out their policy only covered a small fraction of her care.
We were greeted by a Cedars-Sinai admissions agent who stated quite clearly that this policy is useless, that this doesn't even cover one day in a room at Cedars-Sinai, and how are we going to pay for the bill? And so we don't think we can admit you with a policy such as this.
The hospital eventually agreed to admit Charlotte, but Wolfenden's policy would not cover certain drug and treatment options their doctors recommended. Less than 4 months later, Charlotte died at home, and she died with the belief that her family was financially ruined.
We were looking at bills in excess of $700,000. The contract that I read certainly seemed to reflect the conversation that I'd had with the agent. And of course, in retrospect, I realize now that I'd already been victim to the shell game.
There's thousands and thousands of people out there nationwide that have these plans, and they need to be aware of it.
Eric Dyer was a Health Markets agent in Southern California and sold hundreds of policies. He worked there for 4 years, but left when he realized that what the company was peddling was a far cry from what he was trained to believe was one of the best plans in America.
It wasn't really my stuff that was happening as far as claims. It was other agents in the office that started getting claims. And then they started asking questions. And I started asking them questions, and we're like, how does that really work? You know, how come she has $500,000 or $1 million out of pocket when she's supposed to be taken care of? So when you start asking those questions and then you go to management and they don't have an answer for you, everything was very shady.
He said he and his clients thought they were buying a major medical plan which covers most costs for serious illnesses and hospitalizations. And Dyer says the company encouraged the confusion.
We didn't go out there saying it was major medical. We weren't trained to say it was major medical, but that assumption was there. And we didn't do anything to change their assumption. Even in the brochure and stuff, it didn't say like, this is not a major medical plan. You know, they didn't put it in big bold letters for you to read it. People are just assuming that, hey, if you're a health insurance company and Blue Cross is charging me $450 a month now, and you're charging me $450 a month, they're pretty much the same thing, major medical, major medical. No, it's not. They're major medical. This is a specified limit plan. And that's the big difference. And they were never called specified limit plans. I didn't even know there was such a thing called specified limit plans until I left the company.
These plans, commonly called limited benefit plans or mini-meds, are designed to only pay up to a certain amount for any given procedure, leaving the policyholder to come up with the rest.
Every benefit under the sun, from the amount of benefit you have for the hospital room and board to chemo and radiation, tests, doctor visits, everything had a limit. And we were trained that with negotiated rates, network discounts, yada yada, that everything would work out for the consumer. And again, in most cases it did for the largest percentage of claims, but when you have a claim that somebody is in the hospital for weeks, they blow through those limits very easily.
But because policyholders like Howard Wolfenden say they didn't know the actual costs of health care, they trusted their agent's promise that their policy, along with negotiated rates, would be more than adequate to cover major medical issues. However, take a closer look at Wolfenden's policy. His policy suggests it will cover 100% of hospital room and board, but the maximum they will pay is $300 a day. According to a recent Los Angeles Times report, the average cost for one night in a Los Angeles hospital is over $4,000. A trip to the emergency room may be 80% covered as long as it doesn't go over $1,000. An anesthesiologist is covered 100%, but only up to 30% of the amount paid to a surgeon, and not to exceed $1,800. It's a formula that could confuse just about anyone. And the policy claims it will cover 100% of chemotherapy costs. But the most it will pay? $1,000 a day. One day of chemo cost the Wolfendens $14,000. Wolfenden couldn't pay the hospital bill and was forced to apply for charity care. His hospital accepted his application, but there was still a considerable amount of medical debt left. Over the years, Health Markets has made millions selling mini-med policies through its subsidiaries like Megalife and Midwest. Its success grabbed the attention of big players on Wall Street like the Blackstone Group and Goldman Sachs, who formed a private equity consortium to buy the company in 2006. According to Blackstone, one of Health Market's strengths was its strong sales force. However, Eric Dyer says that sales force came with a lot of ethical challenges.
I wouldn't say that it was straight up fraudulent, meaning they told you to go out and lie to people, but there was definitely gray areas or things where it was like almost kind of a bait and switch type of a thing. You call the client over the phone and you might quote them Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and they'll ask you if you're a broker, and you say, yeah, I'm a broker, I'm always broke. But it still leaves the client with the impression you're a broker, even though you didn't really say you're a broker, you just made a joke, right? All the way to, the companies having all the agents sign saying that we're using approved materials in the field, yet them knowing that we're not using approved materials in the field, because otherwise it would have been stopped.
California's Department of Insurance mandates how companies like Health Markets can pitch their policies. But according to the Los Angeles complaint, agents were trained to play the system.
Department of Insurance has their rules about leaving brochures, must leave a brochure, the whole deal, the plan must be explained, and then the actual presentation of how we were trained to present, completely different. Never leave a brochure, try not to leave a brochure, don't say these words, don't say major medical, don't say full coverage, comprehensive coverage.
These kinds of practices got the attention of insurance regulators in 35 states, and they launched an investigation of Health Markets through the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. In 2007, they released their report. Susan Voss, Iowa's insurance commissioner, is now the president of the association.
It's very hard to police an entire industry and go to bed at night and think you've caught every bad actor out there.
The report was a stinging indictment of Health Markets' business practices. But Voss says there are limits to how much companies like Health Markets can be held accountable by regulators like her. With the limited health benefit plans, what's the single biggest thing you think consumers need to understand?
That they're limited, that they're not going to cover everything. And you better be very careful before you purchase one of those. Is that really the type of coverage I want and I need? Because the last thing we want is the consumer calling up afterwards and saying, I thought I had this covered and I don't, and then we have no recourse.
Have any criminal charges, to your knowledge, been brought up against any of these companies?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Well, you mentioned with the Health Markets Company, among the accusations, correct me if I'm wrong, was fraud or something at least borderline fraud.
Actually, it was probably more like misinformation provided. I wouldn't say it was fraud. Now, we have a fraud bureau in each state, and they could certainly look to see if it rose to the level of a criminal action with fraud.
Now, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, they made a settlement. Tell me what the settlement was.
We saw that there were numerous problems with sales conducts by agents, claims processes. They weren't processing claims correctly, paying claims. So collectively, we can obviously do more as a group than just individual states. And we entered an agreement that they had to clean up their sales practices. We know that these limited benefit plans sometimes are not the right type of coverage for people. They may misunderstand what they're purchasing, and quite frankly, the company may continue to be making inappropriate claim payments or misrepresentations. So currently there's an ongoing investigation of additional claims that have arisen. That examination is confidential in nature, so I can't really tell you exactly what's going on, but we're looking at it very closely.
The association fined Health Markets $20 million. But they are not the only ones to find fault with the insurance company. Howard Wolfenden and countless other customers have sued and settled with Health Markets. Plus, 2 state attorneys general have gone after them as well. And now the Los Angeles lawsuit takes it one step further, saying the responsibility goes to the very top of the corporate ownership ladder.
We made the decision to join Goldman and Blackstone as parties to this case.
Felton Newell is a deputy city attorney in Los Angeles. In a first, his office is also going after Health Markets owners, the kings of Wall Street.
This is not a situation where there was a passive investment by financial institutions. And this situation is part of the acquisition by which they became the majority stakeholders in the company. They ensured that a majority of the members of the board of Health Markets would be controlled by people who are affiliated with Goldman and Blackstone. The chair of the board of Health Markets is affiliated with Blackstone. On the key committees, such as the Compliance Committee and Regulatory Committee, a majority of the members are affiliated with Blackstone and Goldman. And since the time they purchased the company in 2006, they have made dividend payments of over $200 million to Blackstone and to Goldman. And based on that, we feel that that reflects a level of direct involvement in the activities of the company and benefiting from the activities of the company, and thus that they should be named as defendants in this lawsuit.
And there is this. We discovered an interview that Health Markets' then CEO and current board member, Philip Hildebrand, gave to an online show produced by the insurance rating house AM Best. The broadcast was recorded in October of 2010, before Los Angeles filed its lawsuit. And in the interview, Hildebrand admits that until recently, the company had serious problems with its sales agents in the field.
As a company, we were not doing what I felt necessary to educate and train our field force. We were not dedicating time toward reviewing and approving pre-approved marketing material, sales material. We needed to do a better job of making sure that the material matched and disclosed any features of the product, and that the agents were well trained on the product and didn't overstate what the product could or could not do.
We've talked to several agents who've told us that their bosses with the company instructed them that the most important thing was to get a sale, was to make sure they closed the deal. And in some cases, if that meant misrepresenting what the policy contained, then they did that. So if the agents are misrepresenting what's in the policy, the company is misrepresenting what's in the policy.
Health markets stopped selling their mini-med policies in 2010, but didn't cancel the ones still in effect. Former agent Eric Dyer believes there are plenty of people who still have them. When Dyer left the company in 2007, he tried to move his clients to other policies, but he was just one agent among thousands.
There's a lot of people out there across the country, in all 50 states, that have these old plans. Some of these people have the plans that go back, way back when they had a $200 daily benefit for hospital room board that nowadays costs you $6,000 a day here in Southern California just for a room and board. So there's a lot of people on old plans that they need to get off those plans. They absolutely need to get off those plans because they're not going to work the way they think they work.
Former salesman Eric Dyer. Health markets declined our interview request and told us they dispute the allegations brought forth by the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. They also said, and I quote, "We continually improve our point-of-sale product materials, policy materials, agent training, and business processes to help ensure the customer understands the products they purchase. We believe these adjustments and improvements meet the needs of our customers and the overall compliance requirements established by regulators in the states where we continue to market our health plans." Unquote. When we come back, an art exhibit with a political twist. That's next. In the wee hours of a recent chilly spring morning in New York City, in front of the famed Plaza Hotel, there's a flurry of activity. Workmen in hard hats are busily unloading and installing a dozen mysteriously wrapped sculptures, while the city that never sleeps continues on, seemingly unaware that a potent symbol of a major political crackdown in China has come to the heart of the Big Apple. A few days later, the wrapping now removed, 12 larger-than-life animal heads stood side by side in the Pulitzer Fountain, a depiction of the Chinese zodiac. A good crowd turned out for the official opening of the exhibit, despite the rainy weather. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg took the podium.
Good morning. It is a bittersweet honor to welcome all of you here today to celebrate a remarkable piece of public art by one of the world's most creative and courageous public citizens, Ai Weiwei.
Then the mayor addressed what most everyone in the crowd already knew. The artist behind this work, Ai Weiwei, would not be attending the opening.
Ai Weiwei could not be with us here for this unveiling of his latest work. As you know, he has been detained by the Chinese government, and the very fact that we do not know where he is or when he will be released is very disturbing.
Before his arrest in early April of 2011, Ai was already a world-famous artist, best known for his design of the Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium in Beijing. But he had fallen increasingly out of favor with the Chinese government because of his outspoken calls for greater openness and accountability. He used his blog to encourage his fellow citizens to expose corruption and incompetence. In one post he wrote, "We live in a despotic political system that needs to be cursed, and it must die before our eyes." Perhaps unsurprisingly, Chinese authorities shut down his blog in May 2009. In 2011, a collection of his blog posts was published in English by the MIT Press. In an interview for the book's epilogue, Ai states, "Politics have always interfered with my life. I think that an artist's concern with attitudes of existence is always related to politics." And his creative activity certainly confirms that. This video, shot by artists working in Ai's studio, is an investigation of the government's response to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, which killed an estimated 70,000 people. Thousands of the dead were children who perished in collapsed school buildings. Ai demanded answers, especially to allegations that political corruption led to poorly built schools. His efforts ultimately resulted in a moving work of art, made up of thousands of children's backpacks, like those left behind in the rubble.
我和公民调查在过去的8个月当中做了大量的工作，掌握。
In the course of his investigation, I says he was beaten by local authorities.
谁啊？警察？什么警察？
He managed to record the audio of the incident, which he subsequently put in a film and released to the public. In the aftermath of the beating, I suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and true to form, he took pictures and tweeted them from his hospital bed. The Chinese government was not amused, and this January it started ramping up the pressure. I had just completed a sprawling new studio in Shanghai when the authorities ordered it destroyed. Of course, I was there to document that as well. These were all big stories in the art world, and Ai's stature outside of China continued to grow. But in his home country, the government was trying to tamp down his celebrity and silence his voice. When we talked to him a few days before his arrest, he told us he knew that his actions, like those of his fellow internet activists, could have grave consequences.
Because you have discussions on the internet, then you can be taken away without legal papers and can be hidden in somewhere nobody would know you, even your family cannot reach you for months. So this is terrifying. It's really like Nazis.
Ai Weiwei is one of many Chinese activists who have been recently detained by a communist government that is taking an increasingly authoritarian stand against its critics. For those who gathered for the opening of Ai's exhibit in New York, the artist's absence was a poignant reminder that under authoritarian regimes, personal expression can be a dangerous activity.
Today, we all stand in solidarity with the millions of people around the world who are hoping that Ai Weiwei is quickly and safely released. And we stand in solidarity with the billions of people who do not have the most fundamental of human rights, the most cherished of all American values, and the most valuable of all New York's riches, and that is free expression.
We all hoped that Ai Weiwei would be able to attend the opening of his sculptures. It's the first large-scale public exhibition of his work in the United States.
Also in attendance at the exhibit's opening was Melissa Chu, who has known Ai Weiwei for many years. She has studied his work since the 1990s.
This is really working more with a sense of value and preciousness. This is one of his earlier pieces.
Chu is an expert on contemporary Chinese art and the museum director at the Asia Society.
So this work by Ai Weiwei is called Grapes.
To try to get a sense of Ai Weiwei the artist, we met Chu at a New York gallery where some of Ai's works are on display.
I think that much of the discussion up until this point has been about his political commentary, and there's been very little ability for us to be able to talk about his creative output, his work as an artist, and so this is an occasion for us to be able to see it. I think Ai Weiwei, of any other artist perhaps in China, is one of the most difficult to categorize. He doesn't just do sculpture, he doesn't just do photographs. He doesn't even just do architecture or some of his political activism. He's always been one of those artists who sought to make statements and then find the best media to do that.
Chu said much of Ai's work challenges modern Chinese cultural assumptions. In the mid-1990s, when the government was tearing down old housing in Beijing to rebuild the city, Ai created a series of photographs of him dropping an ancient Chinese urn.
So in many ways that was something of a commentary on what was going on in Beijing around him. And it's a great introduction to what we might consider to be Ai Weiwei's kind of conceptual practice.
He's painted corporate logos on old Chinese pottery, taken a series of anti-authoritarian photographs, and filled the massive exhibition hall at the Tate Modern Museum in London with 100 million porcelain sunflower seeds.
sunflower seeds are an everyday snack for Chinese people. They eat them all the time. And so it's a kind of marriage of the very precious with the everyday that I think is really at the heart of a lot of Ai Weiwei's more conceptual installation projects. He's always been somebody for whom art and life kind of merged together, and maybe that's why also we see his more recent kind of political statements. I imagine he would consider them as part of his own art practice as well.
Even the Zodiac head exhibit, currently on display in New York, has a subtle political message. Ai's inspiration for the project came from an 18th century water clock built for the Chinese emperor's summer palace just outside of Beijing. Even though the clock, the heads, and much of the palace were built by Chinese craftsmen, the design itself was created by European Jesuits working in the Chinese court. And you can see from this etching that the palace was built in a Western style. But when some of the original Zodiac heads came up recently at auction, the Chinese government tried to block the sale of what it argued were cultural objects that should be returned to China. With his work, Ai Weiwei is suggesting that issues of national identity, art, and ownership are not always clear-cut.
Ai Weiwei, in replicating these heads, wanted to say something about the complexity of what is reclaimed as Chinese heritage. That in fact it might look like Chinese heritage, but it's not necessarily the Chinese heritage that you might assume to have been this pure Han Chinese.
In other words, Ai's Zodiac sculptures suggest that the notion of a purity of Chinese culture, which the Chinese government tries to promote, is problematic.
The most important value of being an artist for me is to connect your emotion and your skills to the land and the time, and to express yourself clearly and to communicate successfully, to build a new structure of communication to reach different audience.
And I worries that these fundamental truths of human expression are being lost in modern China under the tyranny of an oppressive state.
China is not creative. You know, Chinese people is quite smart, but the system made this, because of the collapse of the education under this kind of policy, communist policy, this is a system against the individuality, against the personal freedom, against human rights. So what they're having today is a modern slave.
But I said in the end, the tyranny of the Chinese communist state will be no match for the hopes and aspirations of the people.
Nobody wants a revolution, but everybody wants freedom. The freedom can happen just like the season changed. And once it happens in everybody's mind and heart, a change will come. It doesn't have to have the old way of revolution. It can be miracle, can be peacefully. But it will change. Nobody can stop it.
Ai Weiwei couldn't be here with us physically, but we can still hear from the artist himself. And we're going to do that now, through his words, spoken by 12 members of New York's arts and cultural community who are here today.
New York is the first cosmopolitan city I'm familiar with. It's not one kind of people. It's people from everywhere and a lot of minorities. So I think it's the perfect place for Circle of Animals. It's a zodiac city.
Once you perceive a thing straightforwardly, with a clear mind and no obstacles, you will discover that your resources are inexhaustible. This is because your heart is connected and in harmony with the order of the universe.
My work is always dealing with real or fake authenticity and what's the value. It could be cultural, political, or social, and also it could be art. To put it in a circumstance to make people relook at what we have done. Is original position to create new possibilities.
Without freedom of speech, there is no modern world, just a barbaric one.
Nearly a month and a half after Ai Weiwei's arrest, his wife was finally permitted to see him for a short supervised visit. She reported that he was not in jail and seemed healthy and calm, but tense. Though the government has accused Ai Weiwei of tax evasion, he has yet to be formally charged with any crime. Just ahead, an update on concussions in youth sports. So don't go away. And now an update to a story we continue to follow: the danger of concussions in young athletes. Last year, we visited Mesquite High School in Texas, a place where sports are king.
There you go. Come on, come on, come on.
Because no state or federal guidelines for how to deal with concussions at school were in place, head athletic trainer Bucky Taylor studied the literature, talked to experts, and wrote his own.
You know, I just looked back over my career and I thought, my goodness, I don't know how many concussions I average a year, probably 5 or 6, and I can think back over my career, some of those kids that had really bad concussions. And I took care of them the way the standard of care was at the time, but I worried. I mean, it just worried me because, the NFL's doing, all these studies, they're getting the cadaver brains, and they've been showing some really significant damage to the brain that these gentlemen have had over the years. When I saw that the first time, again, it goes back to me thinking about my career. I think, that could be a brain of a kid that I had. And the first concussion that he had was when he was a freshman at Mesquite High School.
Was that case of sort of a light bulb went off?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I came back and I talked with our athletic trainers in our town, and we kind of felt like we needed to have something in writing, and we all needed to be on the same page.
And today, schools in at least 10 states have adopted a version of Bucky's guidelines as their own. In his home state of Texas, the state legislature has just passed a bill that will require all students in the state to leave a game or practice as soon as a suspected concussion occurs, and they will not be allowed to return to play until cleared by a doctor. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. And stepped down in March. Tonight, he says that the government broke its promise to use that money to help Main Street, not just Wall Street, and that the controversial bailout has left a dangerous legacy. If I'm a welder in Wichita or a carpenter in Casper, tell me why, if there's a reason why, I shouldn't be outraged that the bankers in Wall Street, bearing a lot of responsibility for getting us into the near meltdown stage, have profited greatly from this, but the country as a whole has suffered greatly.
You should be outraged. You should be outraged if you're in that situation, because that wasn't the deal. You shouldn't be angry necessarily that Wall Street is doing well. It's good for the country if Wall Street does well. Again, we wouldn't want to be back where we were in 2008 with the banks going under but the other part of that equation, the Main Street part of the equation, you should be angry, and perhaps you should be a little.
Henry Paulson devised an emergency plan with a staggering price tag and went to Capitol Hill to sell it.
We look forward to working closely with Congress to resolve this financial crisis and get our economy moving again.
a $700 billion taxpayer-funded bailout. The original idea was for Treasury to buy the bank's toxic assets so the banks could begin lending again. On October 3, 2008, after much arm-twisting, President Bush signed the bill that created TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program.
Success or failure will depend on whether Treasury...
2 months later, Neil Barofsky entered the scene. Barofsky was an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York when he was appointed as the Special Inspector General for TARP. His job? To oversee the money. He served in Washington for nearly 2.5 years.
We're going to pay for the bill.
And opening day, an exhibit unveiled in New York, but the artist is behind bars in China.
It is a bittersweet honor to welcome all of you here today to celebrate a remarkable piece of public art by one of the world's most creative and courageous public citizens, Ai Weiwei.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports. Good evening. This past week brought news that our already fragile economic recovery may be stalling. Unemployment is still hovering around 9%. Foreclosure rates remain incredibly high, and Americans continue to be on edge. Wall Street, however, is doing quite well, and the banking part of this crisis at least seems to be behind us. But tonight you're going to hear from a former watchdog with a warning that the measures put in place to avoid another financial meltdown are woefully insufficient. He says another crisis is lurking on the horizon. It's a scary vision of the future, but before you can appreciate what it means, you have to remember where we've been. It was mid-September 2008, and economic Armageddon loomed on the horizon.
This has truly been a manic Monday on Wall Street.
At one point, the market fell as if down a well.
Free fall in Asian stock markets.
Stocks all around the world are tanking.
Housing prices were falling. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. Banks had stopped lending. Panic ensued. Struggling to stave off catastrophe, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and Secretary of the Treasury.
The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, bailing out America's big banks. The man who policed the last bailout says, watch out. There will be a next time, and it will be much worse.
S&P put out an estimate saying that the next crisis may cost $5 trillion in upfront cost just to deal with the large institutions and their assets. Where are we going to find $5 trillion?
Also, many meds, private health insurance on the cheap. But what happens when you really need hospital coverage?
A Cedars-Sinai admissions agent stated quite clearly, this policy is useless. This doesn't even cover one day in a room at Cedars-Sinai. And how will